Welcome everyone to the first Space Sustainability Talk. My name is Daniel Lambach. I'm a political scientist at the University of Frankfurt and a senior associate fellow at the Institute for Development and Peace at the University of Duisburg-Essen. I'm one of the coordinators of Sichtraum. Sichtraum stands for Sicherheit und Technologie im Weltraum, or Security and Technology in Space. We are a network of researchers who analyze the implications of outer space activities for peace and global security. Within Sichtraum, we have formed research clusters. One of them is entitled Space as a Shared Environment, and that is Maximilian Bertamini, Philipp Olbrich, Anne Sönnigsen, and myself, want to take an ecological perspective to space. The topicality of this should be obvious. You're all aware of the rise of miniature satellites, which has led to the number of objects launched into orbit increased by a factor of 6 since 2016. We also see an accumulation of other space debris objects, which make valuable orbital bands more and more congested. So this was the impetus for us to organize the space sustainability talks. We wanted to consult experts to see how serious the problem is and what can be done to move us towards a more sustainable use of outer space. This is the first talk today. We have another 5 planned, all of them on Mondays at 4:30 p.m. This is from a group of experts from across Europe, and we will talk about policy options, about regulatory challenges and issues of justice and equity. And most of these talks will be recorded and will be made available through our YouTube channel. That we start this series today feels quite timely in light of yesterday's communique by the G7 heads of state, which said, among other things, we are committed to the safe and sustainable use of space to support humanity's ambition now and in the future. We recognize the importance of developing common standards, best practices, and guidelines related to sustainable space operations alongside the need for a collaborative approach for space traffic management and coordination. We call on all nations to work together through groups like the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, the International Organization for Standardization, and the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee to preserve the space environment for future generations. Now, this seems like the political will is there and has been there for some time, but my personal impression has been that we haven't seen progress to match these intentions and ambitions. So our first guest in the space sustainability talks today is Dr. Thomas Schrozenski, who will hopefully tell me why I'm wrong or why there's more grounds for optimism. Dr. Schrozenski is a research fellow at the European Space Policy Institute in Vienna, which you're probably all familiar with. He has a PhD in international relations with a dissertation on space policy. He is a chairman of the Slovak Space Policy Association and a former member of the Slovak delegation to UN COPUOS. His talk today will be about current European efforts in space safety, space sustainability, and space traffic management. Listeners, I would urge you to use the chat and the Q&A functions to send in questions during and after the talk. You will also be able to ask these questions in person. Then in that case, just write in question in one of these fields. We will call on you after the talk. Now, Dr. Schrozenski, thank you for joining us today, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Thank you as well for the opportunity to address the audience here today. Yeah, that was excellent introduction, and I do feel that there is, as you mentioned, Daniel, there is some room for optimism here. So at least in Europe, let's get into that. You introduced me well. Maybe just a few more words from me about SP, since we're discussing also networking and resources available. Let me say that most of the SP output is made publicly available, so it's free to read, free to download. So if anybody in the audience is looking for some resources on space policy, space economy, space security, space diplomacy, or other related topics, I invite you to visit our website or follow us on our social media channels, and you will get that information there. All right, so that being said, the topic that I wanted to present today, not going into too much detail, but rather addressing this on the surface, is on the European efforts in space safety, space sustainability, and space traffic management. The introduction was excellent, Daniel, because I maybe do not need to go so much into detail of maybe why these topics are very prominent as of today. I wouldn't say that they are, they have not been prominent in the past. It's just the current trends, and you mentioned some of them. I don't know, with the small satellites, or maybe with the emergence of these new concepts of large constellations of communication satellites, in particular in the low Earth orbit, are really driving new efforts and driving the vigilance of the international community in these topics. And I wanted to take the, to use this talk as the opportunity to actually highlight, and maybe that would be the key message that I would say up front, that Europe has already done a tremendous amount of effort in the past, and continues to be active in so many domains, that relate to space safety or space sustainability, that I think that's a good starting point. And maybe towards the end of the talk, I would like to identify a few questions that we can further discuss, questions that I call, let's say, outstanding questions that I do not have answer for. Like, it's something that I believe will necessarily need to be addressed by the European stakeholders in this domain, that include member states, international organizations, private sector. So issues that will need to be addressed, and that will in this way shape how Europe collectively, or how different European actors will move on, and how their future approach to these topics will look like. Point one that I would like to say is that Europe has a good legacy in these topics. I've heard some people arguing that Europe has actually not really been that much of a polluter of space. And I mean, if you look at some of these metrics that are available at hand, such as, what is the origin of the tracked pieces of space debris, or this great research paper that, what should be let's say, the top 50 objects that needs to be deorbited in order to increase the capacity of in particular, the low Earth environment, or in terms of the pursuit of the anti-satellite or counter space capabilities. European actors, European countries, or ESA or EU, have not really been, so much engaged in these topics as others, or are not prominently represented in these statistics, which is a good positive sign. But it goes beyond that. In a sense that one useful example in this regard, it could be made that one of the most renowned bodies, the Interagency Debris Coordination Committee, the so-called IADC, has actually evolved from something which used to be a NASA-ESA bilateral space debris coordination at the end of 1980s. So there is a good legacy in that. The good legacy is also visible in the fact that European countries have generally signed and ratified the UN treaties, have established, and gradually more and more countries are establishing their national space legislation and regulatory processes that should lead to increased safety and increased spaceflight safety and long-term space sustainability. So there is a good starting point, I would say, good history on which Europe can build upon. Then the second point is like, okay, let's break down what are these European activities that are worth mentioning in this regard, those current activities, that are really running as we speak now. And for that, I would like to recall, the particularities of more general governance or roles and responsibilities when it comes to space matters in Europe. I'm not sure if we have really a European audience, or if there are also other attendees, but generally we speak that the European governance scheme for the space activities Europe is quite multi-layered. So there is this layer or level of national member states, European member states. There is this level of more of a intergovernmental frameworks embodied, for instance, in the activities of ESA or EUMETSAT. There is also another intergovernmental and supranational framework represented in the EU, and on top of that also the private sector. And why I think it's important to mention is also that these different formats or these different levels of activity are, I think, quite a useful tool in looking at what Europe is actually doing in space safety and space sustainability. Let's maybe start with ESA. Again, as I mentioned, I don't want to be too exhaustive. So if I forget something, and if we have ESA people attending here, I apologize for that. One of the first things that comes to my mind when looking at the activities of ESA is really the long history of space debris related research and basically an excellence in space debris related research. And more recently, there has been this great publication mapping the evolution of the debris environment in near Earth orbits, which is the Space Environment Report. Again, a freely publicly available document available on ESA website. A very useful resource. On top of that, while ESA may not have been the comparable level to the development of SSA sensors or the hardware part of monitoring the orbits, it has dramatically, improved in the provision of software and different software suites and programs for researchers and for other actors that they can use in their research related to space debris or in their, let's say, operational activities such as operation of spacecraft in Earth orbits. Since 2013, some could notice the Clean Space Initiative, targeting the ecological design aspects ranging from different propellants, materials, processes used, going up to active debris removal activities. And speaking of which, since 2019, ESA has also contracted a private actor, a Swiss company, ClearSpace, for the first, let's say, active debris removal service, a mission which should be targeting, I believe, some kind of a payload adapter from the upper stage of the Vega launcher. And on top of that, ESA implemented its own, space debris mitigation policy for its own projects. It's engaged, also important to note, with in the international technical bodies on standardization or for bodies for identification of best practices, which is important to say. I mentioned the IADC. So that's maybe one level, a few examples of the engagement. Then we can say ESA is composed of 22 member states and some associate members and Canada. And so at that national member state level, there is another range of activities that one can highlight in this regard. For me, we can categorize that into, let's say, 3 categories: capacity activity or capability activities or capacity building activities, which is one thing, regulatory activities, and then diplomatic engagement or international engagement. In terms of capabilities, I believe it's important to know that when it comes to space situational awareness capabilities or infrastructures, in Europe, it is mostly the nation states or the European states that are owners and operators of these assets, so telescopes, radars, or laser ranging stations. Important to say, with a very strong military footprint. So in many countries, most of these sensors are handled and operated by militaries. What we can maybe say from the regulatory domain is to say that European countries do regulate in line with the requirements posed by the international space treaties, regulate their domestic space activities. In case of France, the local space law could be mentioned as a useful example, developed in 2008, since France is also a launching state according to the international guidelines and the way how space law defines launching states. And maybe a useful example from this kind of a diplomatic engagement on top of let's say, international lawmaking and the international space treaties adopted through the UN framework, is the aspect of bilateral SSA data sharing agreements, which is rather a more recent example in which several European countries, including ESA, have developed and approved, signed bilateral SSA data sharing agreements with the US Space Command, which serves an important spaceflight purpose for them. We can see also for the US, as they get another source of data to their own systems. So a few examples on this front. Then the third level that I want to mention here is the level of the private sector. Industry, commercial perspectives. What we can say here about when it comes to Europe. So, I mean, Europe has long really been a leader in terms of, how European space industry has, say, performed on launch services market, in satellite manufacturing, or in satellite operations and provision of services. And maybe one important thing we can really say in here is that in Europe we have several established and long functioning satellite operators, in particular for the geostationary orbit, who has a long-standing practice of handling satellite operations, and even have established with other non-European partners the Space Data Association, which is an interesting example in my view to be pointed out, because Space Data Association essentially serves as some kind of a space traffic management mechanism for the participating operators, both private and some of them public. So on top of that, we can say that European companies, some of European companies are also operators of national space surveillance centers. Maybe I don't know, GMV could be a good example in this regard, which handles the Spanish SST center. Some European companies are also commercial providers of SSA data and services. Maybe we can say maybe we do not have so much of these worldwide and renowned champions and leaders. Some would say that perhaps some US companies are rather leading here, but also in Europe, at least what comes to the top of my mind is that Ariane Group has its own network of sensors. Safran provides SSA services. So this can be an interesting example as well. At the side of manufacturers, what I have noticed more recently is the Eurospace level, which brings together, the Association of European Satellite Manufacturers. Eurospace issued lately a position paper on space traffic management, strongly arguing for the need for a common European approach in this regard. And so one of the things that we at SP have developed in our own STM report published last year is that we believe there is a need for a common European vision, and this Eurospace paper argued for the same thing. Maybe that's it. There's a few examples for this private level. The fourth and the last level of activity that I want to mention is the EU, the European Union, which has not really been in Europe one of the maybe more traditional or actors with a longer historical presence. So it's more of a recent actor. It's more of a recent trend that European countries do want to pursue some space-related activities also through this framework, and the European Commission, as its executive arm, is also presenting its own agenda, own vision, and own ideas how this can be further pursued. And maybe what's clearly presented, or what's clearly visible here, is that this increasing EU engagement in this space is manifesting also in some of the space safety and space sustainability topics. For instance, in establishing the SSA as one of the components of the EU space program. And more recently, we can see that in the European Commission positioning on space traffic management, in funding a few research projects on space traffic management, which are going as we speak. The diplomatic arm of the EU, so the European External Action Service, has in 2019 initiated the 3 SOS initiatives, so the safety, sustainability, and security, I think, space activities, building upon maybe an unsuccessful legacy of the International Code of Conduct for Outer Space Activities, but I would say having in mind the same idea that what needs to be done is a responsible behavior in outer space. Some of these activities really maybe stand at the crossroads, and at the crossroads of different levels. What I would mention here in this regard, it was the setting up of the European Union Space Surveillance and Tracking Support Framework, and through that the EU SST consortium, bringing together several European member states in the networking national sensors for space situational awareness, and eventually providing operational services, which the EU SST, the abbreviation for that framework, is providing now as we speak. So why do I say it stands at the crossroads? Because it has some EU element, in that, for instance, through provision of funding, but the governance mechanism for that is really rather an intergovernmental framework comprised, of the participating several European member states. So maybe that would be it in terms of like the examples of what Europe is currently engaged with in these topics. One can clearly see that the topics are quite prominent. In particular, when it comes to space traffic management, a lot of stuff, a lot of new developments we see this year and the last year. And I mentioned that I would like to conclude my introduction today with maybe some of the outstanding issues, questions that I believe will need to be further addressed. For me, one of the first things here, we can link it to technologies, to capabilities. And in that front, I do not think we have yet found the right recipe in Europe to the level of autonomy that Europe wants to have when it comes to SSA or space situational awareness or STM. Why I'm saying that is that there has clearly been a growing interest in funding of these activities at the EU level, but one can question whether that appropriated funding, let's say for the next 7 years in the new EU space program, so around 250 million, would be adequate. Some people, I noticed some people putting into perspective this with the recently initiated operational US space fence radar in the Pacific Ocean used for SSA, which the system itself just costed 1.2 billion, I think, or even more. I do not have the specific figures in mind. And so, recently we were discussing a lot about the fact that EU wants to be strategically autonomous in numerous capabilities. SSA capabilities are let's say, intrinsically important for the protection of the European space infrastructures, which result from public investments. And whether can we really say that Europe is autonomous right now when European actors in SSA still need to rely on the provision of US SSA data? And if we want to be autonomous as Europeans, are we putting enough public money on that? I'm not saying we are. I'm just asking the question because I don't think we have found the right recipe yet. So more activities will need to be handled in this domain, in my opinion. And then a second kind of a big point for me would be finding the right level of involvement and engagement of the European Union, as this is, as I mentioned, quite, let's say, growing or expanding also into the domain of space safety, space sustainability, but also in the domain of space security or space defense, where the links between civil and military space are rather blurred. Again, I have to see how this formulates. Some things have been said, for instance, through the setting up of the SSA component of the space program. But as I mentioned, developments on particular in let's say adopting or finding the European approach to space traffic management are ongoing through different activities. So this we'll have to see how these things eventually formulate. Maybe the last thing that I would like to mention here is that, and we argued also for that as SSP in one of our publications, is the need for a common European vision or approach in this regard. And I know what I'm saying is maybe a bit vague in a sense, but what I mean with this is to say that perhaps in Europe, we often tend to say like who should do what in space activities, and it would be, I think it would be bad if we try to go into that direction when we're discussing space safety or space sustainability or STM, in particular because we can acknowledge that there is a very complex governance landscape for space activities, but in these topics, each of these actors, I believe, has some sort of a role. So it's not to say that who should do STM or who should do space sustainability in Europe. It's more to say what components could be handled by whom, and if we can as a Europeans find this widespread agreement for that would certainly help for the future. I would maybe then stop here. So that's all for me as an introduction. I'm looking forward to any comments, suggestions, or questions from the audience.
Thank you for the very concise talk. Again, I'll remind our guests that if you want to ask a question, either write it in the Q&A or write it in the chat, or just indicate in the chat that you have a question so that we can unmute your mic and give you a chance to ask it in person. In the meantime, I would like to pick up on the final point, this need for a common European vision and approach. It seems to me that this is sort of very obviously where the benefits lie, because you can't have, let's say, 20, 30 different space sustainability approaches within Europe, let alone, in the world, let alone in Europe itself. But even this seems a bit remote. You indicated, well, this might be still a bit vague in what you're calling for. So could you elaborate on that a little bit, and specifically, how do we get there? How do we get European countries to formulate such a more integrated vision of space sustainability?
A good point. Maybe a few examples that came to my mind, and I will try to use them to explain what I mean in here is that the decision-making levels. So there are numerous decision-making levels, and maybe too many decision makers that when it comes to Europe. In particular, when we're discussing the EU level, because you might have the Commission as the executive arm, the European Parliament, the co-legislative body that represents the European citizens through directly elected members of the European Parliament, and then you can have the member states represented in the Council of the European Union, and even just the discussions for the new space programs have been maybe too painful, one can even say, and prolonged. That having such a vast amount of decision-making levels, bringing together different types of stakeholders with potentially different interests, if we can even then add the private sector and representatives of the private sector in that, it's very complex. And the maybe example for that could be the concept of space traffic management, which has long been discussed. It's not really a new topic, but which has led, or which has been used in 2018 in the US, which has been used in the development of a national space traffic management policy. So that has been in June 2018, an executive level document at the White House level. Back then, it was the Trump administration. And so the US set up its own approach to space traffic management. And discussions are currently taking place here in Europe about the European positioning on this topic, and it's quite possible. And then I do not see that much into detail of these discussions, but I'm quite sure that there could be differences between what the private sector think is STM and what STM should be about, what member states think about it, and what maybe the European Commission or European Space Agency thinks about it. And even, let's say, if we stay at the level of the individual member states, it's quite possible that the difference of some countries might be different. I don't want to say which countries have what position, but bringing this all together is a challenging exercise, and different strategic interests are in that regard. And final example here that I would mention is that when the US space traffic management policy was adopted in 2018, it sparked some, I would say, strong reaction in the European community, or space industry community, so in the private sector. And it has been explained in some of the papers that European space industry felt, we could say, concerned that the US approach to STM, which was actually calling for adoption or adherence to space safety standards that only could be met by following US technologies or US services, would actually have a deteriorating or harmful impact on the competitiveness of the European space industry, because it cannot access and use and be like that, meet those requests or meet those safety requirements unless relying on US providers should this be the case that the US STM policy become the sort of like the gold standard. So that was one of the reasons why the European space industry has been calling that, in Europe, we need to have a common vision. We need to have a European vision because that is a stronger policy position than just if it's a position of one of even the bigger countries. But then where is the dilemma? No, where is the balance between having STM is, I'm not saying STM is just about regulation, but there is a regulatory component to space traffic management. And some could say, maybe space lawyers would say that we need to have such an STM or space law that we do maximum we can towards space safety or space security and towards mitigation of the proliferation of space debris. But some of these requirements could potentially be damaging to competitiveness, as they would imply, higher cost to space missions to the industry should it needs to do more testing, should it needs to do more safety measures. So I think it's still an open question, how to strike that proper balance that you would, in a regulatory perspective, that you would support the safety aspect while not inhibiting the commercial perspectives or the innovation perspectives.
Great point. I'll be sure to get back to that a little later, but the first questions have come in and I want to give our guests a shot. Florian Eiselbrecher asks about the relations of European countries and emerging space countries. So his question is, how does the EU or its member states engage in promoting space safety and sustainability with emerging spacefaring countries? What role should it play towards them in the future?
Unfortunately, I do not have a good reply on that, as I'm not particularly aware of any specific actions that the EU would take against that the EU would do in the engagement with emerging spacefaring countries. What the EU has, I would say, been doing for long is this calling for responsible behavior in outer space, adherence to the principles of space safety and sustainability, or peaceful uses of outer space. There has been recently the legal session of the UN Committee for Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and so when I was reading the EU statement, it's still there, as it always has been. And so the EU has been able in the past, in this ICOC initiative, to bring on board some of the, let's say, maybe less capable spacefaring countries, so not those that would be space powers, but those that maybe are in the second or third rank when it comes to their space involvement. But I don't think I have the recipe on the second question. What role should it play towards them in the future? From the leadership perspective, and the EU, according to the statements made by EU representatives such as Thierry Breton, EU considers itself, or European executives considers EU or Europe as the second space power in the world. So provided that this is a avenue that we want to continue to present, that then engagement with other spacefaring countries, maybe even beyond Europe, could be used as a vehicle to further promote this kind of a European approach to space also beyond.
I guess this takes us back to the issue we just talked about, that without a clear vision, it's kind of hard to take a unified approach to global space diplomacy. Okay, another question comes from Helmut Ganser in the chat. He asks, given that space technology is getting cheaper and the private sector has been growing, did you consider the possibility of non-state terrorist acts in space? It does remind me of that kind of infamous statement by Senator Ted Cruz in the Senate hearings about the creation of the US Space Force, that this was necessary to deter pirates from attacking US space assets. Now, this might sound fanciful, but it's probably not that impossible a scenario. So what about the security side of this?
I would share your assessment, Daniel. I wouldn't dare to say like what's the actual probability of that, but theoretically, yes. I mean, with decreasing costs related to access to space. I would say, one thing I would say that we often, our space security debate often tends to navigate towards counter space capabilities and damaging or disrupting space systems so that they cannot provide the services that they provide. I don't think it's that easy as it seems. It's certainly not that easy, to maneuver in space. It's certainly not that easy to make like kinetic asset weapon to shoot down someone else's satellite. It's, I would say, not that easy to do a co-orbital ASATs where you really need the precise telemetry, where you need the excellent operations to be able to navigate where you want to navigate. Sometimes for me, a good example in this regard of like the maneuverability in space, it's not that easy as it seems, is the fact that the United States, the US military operates a reusable space plane. I think it's called X-37B, which has been used, I guess, for 5 or 6 times now, flying really long missions in low Earth orbit, like 2-year missions. And there has been a lot of debate that where it is and what is it doing for so long in space. And one of the European astronomers have tracked the object continuously. Like I just saw his blog article on this where he mentioned that it hasn't moved that much. So yes, it is reusable. It spends 2 years in space and it safely lands on the runway on the airport. But it does not function in a sense that it goes from one object to another, changing orbital altitude, changing orbital planes. I mean, those things require a tremendous amount of fuel, in particular, if you want to change the orbital plane. So theoretically, yes, but and I would say that there has certainly been cases of jamming or spoofing of the signals, or maybe blinding some of these satellites through lasers, I think. So I'm not fully aware of that, but I think it sounds easier than it actually is, and in reality, I think it's much more difficult.
Well, my supposition is that we're probably not going to see any kind of non-state terrorism in kinetic terms, but possibly more in cybersecurity terms, involving hacking of space assets or something like that. But that's still an open question. I would like to get back to that, to some of the strands we sort of left dangling regarding the European space industry and basically which role Europe can take. Now, Europe, or more specifically the EU, has shown itself to be capable to be kind of a leader in terms of regulations in certain sectors, not necessarily in space, but when it comes to data protection or industrial standards, it has been able to kind of impose its weight, let's say. Now, you indicated, well, that's a bit of a delicate balance to tread there. On the one hand, we want clear standards for space sustainability. And on the other hand, we don't want to formulate these standards in a way that they make our domestic or our European space industries uncompetitive. But would it be possible, kind of like in the example you mentioned about US laws, US regulations kind of extending to other operators, wouldn't it be possible to use the kind of network effect these regulations have to kind of raise the bar in terms of sustainability standards extending outwards from Europe?
I think yes. In generally speaking, I think I would agree on this front with you. Though I'm not sure. I'm not so sure about whether we can discuss European regulations. If by a regulation, linguistics, how do one define regulation? That's kind of a hard thing. But if that's something which goes on the same level as with the general data protection regulation, can we have something for that in Europe on space safety, space sustainability? I'm not sure. It's defined. Space is defined in Lisbon Treaty as a shared competence, but that's saying everything and nothing at the same time. I do believe that the hard regulatory aspect in Europe will probably continue to be a national issue or a national responsibility. However, that does not prevent other types of norms to be pursued in different frameworks, different European frameworks, and something which is a non-binding, which is a best practice, which is a guideline, a recommendation, a standard. The standard in itself is a non-binding document unless specifically requested by a legally binding document. To conclude on that, I would maybe echo what I've heard Holger Krag from ISA say multiple times, and that's it. That eventually there are good recommendations and guidelines put in place already, but maybe what has not been achieved so far is that the adherence to those guidelines by operators or by those who conduct space activities is yet to meet. You know, the compliance with those guidelines has not yet been fully met, and maybe what would eventually help would, if the if those people or those organizations that conduct space activities would meet to those guidelines, and that would actually increase the space safety and space sustainability. And maybe Europe, I don't know, maybe Europe can be a trailblazer in, you know, in better monitoring, verification of this compliance. Not to say that others are not doing it. Perhaps some are even more capable. But it's certainly one of the avenues where this kind of a European element could be helpful. Maybe could have some positive kind of a political spillover effect.
Well, I guess these gaps in implementation and compliance are why us political scientists exist, or at least why we have something to say on this issue. Now, one of your many roles is as chairman of the Slovak Space Policy Association, an NGO. Now, how can civil society get involved in this issue? I ask this because my impression as something of a latecomer to the field is that civil society in space policy is less prominent than it is in other fields of sustainability or environmental concerns. So how do we get civil society involved here? And maybe you can use your association as an example of what you think works well or doesn't work.
Yeah, I dare to, you know, well, I won't dare to comment on your assessment because I just don't have the enough information to be able to make such a comment, whether space is, you know, there is less or there is more of civil society engagement. And also I would rather dodge the question because, you know, the example of the Slovak Space Policy Association is very specific in a sense that those 5-6 years ago where we formed the NGO, very loose, you know, very few people in that, was that Slovakia was a country and at that time which was part of the Europe, which was part of the developed world, but which had quite limited presence in the international or in the European space sector. A long legacy of scientific research going all back to participation on some of the Soviet programs back when Czechoslovakia was part of the Eastern Bloc in the second half of the past century. But back at that time when we were forming with few of my space-related space colleagues, our view was to help the decision-making processes from the civil society standpoint or from the civil society perspective with an informed view of issues that relate to space law, space legislation, or setting up of national space policy or space strategy. And the processes have moved on since then in Slovakia. I wouldn't say it's because of us. I would say that we tried to contribute to those processes, but no, that was a very specific example. And so when you're asking how the civil society can, you know, be of a better use in the broader international space sector, in particular when it comes to space safety, space sustainability, I would say it would be civil society has the best capacity to, maybe point with finger on who are the bad guys, who are the those that are not maybe compliant with those principles and with those space safety, space sustainability principles, or with more detailed recommendations and guidelines. However, for that you need capabilities to be able to measure, to be able to monitor, to measure, and to make that assessment. So maybe it's more about the interplay between public actors or commercial actors at one side and the civil society on the other, so that the civil society actors would be more capable of actually serving as this sort of a watchdog, and making sure that space sustainability is our shared interest.
And I think there's actually more scope here than in many other traditional fields of civil society and private corporation engagement, because it seems that private corporations are actually quite willing to accept more regulation when it comes to space activities, simply because they operate in, well, not in a legal vacuum, but the things I hear seem to indicate that many companies would be happy to accept a higher level of standards, or
I would say from
at
my
least more
personal
clarity.
Engagement. So this is really just saying based on the talks and discussions that I had with people. I think I share your assessment on this. I keep hearing the same issues exactly for the same reasons that you mentioned. One example that can further provide some further information into this is that generally speaking, national space legislations often provide a certain instrument that is maybe of interest to those who conduct space activities, private actors conducting space activities, which is that they usually, space law or national space legislation usually requires you as the operator to pursue a third-party insurance. So if anything happens and you damage someone else's property, you need to be insured for that. And some space laws, they set a ceiling for that insurance, saying that you need to pursue, you need to buy an insurance policy for up to 60 million of euros. And eventually, if something happens and the claims to you are even higher than that, then the state will cover for that. So even if there is more, you don't need to buy a more expensive insurance policy because the state is there for you in a sense. And yes, maybe that could be also the sense that just to further the argument that there could potentially be reasons why you and I heard private actors speaking, they're technically speaking not against more regulation.
Exactly. I mean, legal uncertainty might create opportunities for business, but it also constitutes a business risk in accounting and controlling terms. So companies usually aren't keen on that.
Maybe another interesting example in this regard is, but this is not so much related to space safety or space sustainability, is this new emerging topic of space resources utilization. These concepts of visions of mining the asteroids or something like that. Though, I mean, more realistically, what we're discussing here is more like in situ extraction and exploitation of resources, like for propulsion or for materials for planetary habitats. And some of these countries, there has not been so many of these countries that have set up national legal frameworks for that, like the US and Luxembourg have been maybe spearheading those efforts in the past years. And those legal regimes are targeting, let's say, protection of commercial interests, meaning that if you set up a company in our country, we will make sure that according to our legal regime, you will, whatever you do commercially, you will have a commercial rights for that to sell it in a sense, like to put it very very bluntly, and that also adds to, you know, this kind of a safety. I don't want to say whether it's legal or illegal. I know there has been for years there has been legal discussions on that. I eventually feel that we're moving towards, you know, acceptance of this, while still years from demonstration and operational activities in this domain. But just to illustrate the example that when we're discussing this legal uncertainty or certainty, this has recently also been an interesting example in this domain.
Yes, exactly. And it does add another dimension to the discussions about sustainability, because as with any resource, questions will quickly turn to how it can be sustainably managed. Now, I keep thinking that there must be ways of learning from, or of maybe forging alliances with actors in more traditional environmental policy fields, because it feels like we're just now starting to have the discussions that they've been having for 2 or 3 decades now. But maybe that's something to ponder, and it's something we will get back to as the space sustainability talks progress. Now, Dr. Schrozenski, thank you very much for being with us today. I very much enjoyed the discussion and learned a lot about what European countries and actors are doing. And I would agree that there's more scope for optimism, but in true European fashion, it's all very well intentioned, but a bit piecemeal, and could do with a bit more vision and a bit more willingness to embrace the issue. So in that sense, European space policy is much like other policy fields, I suppose. Right, next week we have our next talk scheduled. It's our guest then will be Rada Popova, legal counsel or general counsel for ESA Aerospace and a lecturer in public international law and EU law at the University of Cologne. And her talk will be on sustainability in outer space, achieving the unachievable, focusing particularly on the legal avenues to work towards a sustainable use of space. I hope that you enjoyed the talk today, and I hope to see many of you and more again next week. Again, thanks, Dr. Schrozenski.
No, thank you for having me, and for that conclusion as well. You know, I always think that I'm not super good at the concluding things, so you made my life easier there.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and have a nice evening.
Goodbye. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.